Okay, hello everyone, this is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 4 audio lecture for English 1020. Today we have a lot to talk about, a lot of different poems and poets to talk about, but the focus for today is this remarkable period in the early 20th century called the Harlem Renaissance. And you'll notice if you look at the reading schedule, I've asked you to read a little bit from your textbook that will help to contextualize the Harlem Renaissance. It's not a lot, it's about 4 or 5 pages. I won't read those pages, but I did want to say a little something about the Harlem Renaissance as a way of framing the conversation I want to have today. And one of the best places to start when thinking about the Harlem Renaissance is to think about the Great Migration. So from 1910 to 1920, significant Black thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois encouraged members of the Black population in the South to move or migrate to the North into abandoned areas in New York like Harlem. Also think about major cities like Chicago and Detroit. Some estimates claim that nearly 300,000 African Americans migrated north during the Great Migration. The Harlem Renaissance is important because it was a moment when African Americans attempted to create or establish a sense of cultural identity in a predominantly white New York neighborhood. And now here I'm thinking exclusively about Harlem in New York. Like many things, the Harlem Renaissance began to waver when the stock market crashed in 1929. In the subsequent decade, many prominent Black artists and intellectuals fled Harlem for economic reasons. The unfulfilled promises of Reconstruction, that moment between 1865 and 1877 that followed the American Civil War, when we as a nation attempted to redress the massive inequalities that racism and slavery wrought, left many African Americans feeling disillusioned. Because of this, two competing but not mutually exclusive themes emerged during this period: racial pride and resentment. Both of these themes are visible in the literature, art, and music of this period. The takeaway from the movement is the way in which its proponents legitimized Black identity. The sense of unity and community helped to codify the notion that African Americans are human beings who deserve, among many things, equal treatment. And one of the things that I certainly want to talk about today is this notion of racial pride and resentment, because I think both of these ideas, both of these themes are on display in the poetry that I asked you to read. So again, if you want to know more about the Harlem Renaissance, what I just said is certainly nothing more than an introduction or a broad survey. I would encourage you to look to your textbook because there's a lot of interesting and thought-provoking information there. And if you're still thinking about an essay you want to write, and you'll certainly have an opportunity to address this for the poetry unit exam, which will come in, I believe, 2 weeks, maybe next week, check the schedule. You'll certainly have an opportunity to think about some of the poetry that I asked you to read for this week within this larger context of the Harlem Renaissance. So with all of that said, why don't we begin by reading and discussing the County Cullen poem From the Dark Tower, which begins on page 1072. We shall not always plant while others reap the golden increment of bursting fruit, not always countenance abject and mute. The lesser men should hold their brothers cheap, not everlasting while others sleep. Shall we beguile their limbs with mellow flute, not always bend to some more subtle brute? We were not made eternally to weep. The night whose sable breast relieves the stark, white stars, is no less lovely being dark, and there are buds that cannot bloom at all in light, but crumple, piteous and full. So in the dark we hide the heart that bleeds, and wait and tend our agonizing seeds. Okay, so the first thing I would want to perhaps bring to your attention is the speaker and what sorts of conclusions we might draw from thinking about the speaker of this poem. So you'll notice first the word we begins this poem. It's not I, it's not you, it's collective. And I think there's a couple of things we could deduce from this use of the plural pronoun we instead of the singular pronoun I or the singular pronoun you. And I think part of what Cullen wants to do here is to make this feel like a collective effort. This is something you see quite often in the Harlem Renaissance, these sorts of moves toward seeing everything that's happened, the racism and the racial inequality and the attempts to dramatize what all of that means and the trauma and the bad feelings that those choices produced as something collective. Yes, of course, it was experienced by individuals, and we certainly have countless examples of poems that use the first person I, but I think it is notable here that Cullen wants to make this more of a collective feeling. He wants this to be a collective experience. So it's we shall not always instead of I or you. Now, you'll notice that this poem has a distinct rhyme and meter to it, which is quite interesting. Now, this is something we see with Claude McKay as well, because the Harlem Renaissance, while a lot of students, if they have any experience with the Harlem Renaissance, they often think of figures like Langston Hughes, who wrote in this fluid, free, it almost feels a bit like jazz. There's something improvisational about his verse. And because of that, a lot of students just deduce that part of what defines the Harlem Renaissance is this break from or this rejection of traditional classic forms like rhyming patterns, meter, etc. But that's not necessarily true. Again, with poets like Claude McKay, he was actually quite committed to these older, more antiquated traditional forms, and we see someone like Cullen doing something quite similar. So don't be surprised to see that a lot of the poetry I asked you to read has a distinct rhyming pattern and a distinct meter to it. Because yes, while figures like Langston Hughes didn't do that, he broke from that tradition in a rather radical and interesting way. That's not to say there aren't figures within this tradition that appeal to more traditional poetic forms. Now, what I also like about what this poem does, it effectively deploys a lot of metaphors and visual imagery that we associate with nature, and Cullen uses all of these references in an interesting way to show this dichotomy or this hierarchy between those in a position of power, which are the white majority, and those who don't have as much power or any power, which would be the black minority. And so we see, especially in this opening stanza, if you look, for example, at the opening line, this sense of sowing and reaping as a way of thinking about living one's life, experiencing prosperity, and again, some of these hierarchies that really defined and continue to define so much of American racial history. Cullen writes, "We shall not always plant while others reap." So think about the kind of dichotomy this establishes. There are those who are in effect workers, those who do this work, those who work, for example, in a field or tend and toil on the land, but then there are those who reap. So again, there is this distinction between those who do work, those who labor, and those who enjoy the fruits of that labor. And one of Cullen's points seemed to be those who do the work, those who plant, regrettably are not those who also reap. And again, I would ask you, what do you think the tone of the speaker is here? Because all of these, again, references to nature, especially in the opening stanza, there are some subtle criticisms and critiques of, again, those who reap, those who are in a position of power and authority, but it doesn't feel nearly as perhaps angry or aggressive as you might expect, considering what it is this speaker is speaking about. For example, there are these references to brutes and brutality, but again, I wonder, do you think there's something subdued about the speaker's tone? And if so, why would they do that? Why use or deploy a more subtle and subdued tone? Now, what I like about the second stanza is how Cullen takes this idea of darkness as we conventionally understand it, as something negative, something to be skeptical of. Think about any time, for example, if you've ever watched a Disney film, those characters who are cloaked in darkness, they're often the villains. There's something morally compromised, or they're these morally abject figures. And again, this is something we see in fairy tales, mythology, etc. You could think of just, again, countless examples, it seems, of how darkness is associated with moral depravity or something negative. But Cullen does something interesting here, and he turns that idea on its head. So in the second stanza, what he writes is, "The night whose sable breast relieves the stark white stars is no less lovely being dark. And there are buds that cannot bloom at all in light, but crumble, piteous, and fall. So in the dark we hide the heart that bleeds, and wait and tend our agonizing seeds." So there's a couple of interesting things happening here, again, with this notion of darkness. Notice how, again, he seems to want to challenge this idea that darkness is something that is unmistakably negative. We see a kind of blending of darkness and light, white and black, and I would encourage you to read that as symbolically loaded as possible, because he's not just obviously making reference to nature. There's something far bigger, far more consequential happening here as well. But also notice how darkness, it's hospitable to light. And here, light is associated with stars, and again, read that as symbolically rich and loaded as possible. But also notice this idea that in the darkness, there's something that, if you wanted to use language like hides, because that's the language he uses, that would be appropriate. But within the darkness, there's something that grows, something that darkness can cultivate. And again, I would encourage you, read all these references to darkness as symbolically loaded. There's something symbolically rich about how Cullen makes reference to darkness here, because again, I think ultimately what he wants to do, what he's attempting to do, is demystify this idea that darkness is something that is wholly and unmistakably negative. If anything, he wants to emphasize some of the more positive characteristics that we should associate with darkness. And again, I think there's a larger, more symbolic racial component to all of these references to darkness. So the County Cullen poem From the Dark Tower, a couple of things, again, just quickly in summary. Think about the speaker. I think the speaker is interesting. Again, notice how it's not an I pronoun. It's not a you pronoun. It's a we. There's something quite collective about, or this gesture towards the collective. But also all of these references to nature, I think, are quite interesting. I think it has the effect, it does the work of grounding the poem in interesting ways, in particular in environments that would have been native to the Black community that Cullen clearly addresses in this poem because of this history of slavery in the United States. Again, thinking about this distinction between planting, working a field, and reaping. And again, remember, those who would reap the rewards of all of that work and labor was not traditionally, of course, those Black slaves who did that work. And the final thing, of course, is how, and this is an extension of what I just said, the way he challenges some of these notions and assumptions about darkness. Again, thinking about darkness in a traditional way, if you think about how it's often deployed in literature, mythology, fairy tales, Disney films, there's something unmistakably negative about it, but Cullen turns that idea on its head. He tries to contextualize it in a far more broader and interesting way. So for those reasons, I think From the Dark Tower is a fantastic example of the sort of poetry that poets like County Cullen produced during the Harlem Renaissance. So now I want to transition to, it's on the same page, it's a shorter poem by Angelina Grimke, The Black Finger. Okay. I have just seen a beautiful thing, slim and still, against a gold sky. A straight cypress, sensitive, exquisite, a black finger pointing upwards. Why, beautiful still finger, are you black? And why are you pointing upwards? So, Grimke's an interesting entry for the Harlem Renaissance because she both obviously produced poetry during this period we call the Harlem Renaissance, but she also produced poetry. She didn't publish a lot, though. She produced a lot of poetry in the late 19th and early 20th century. And one of the ways I want us to think about this poem is within a particular sort of context, because anytime a black poet like Grimke, especially during this period, makes references to trees, I think one of the first things we should think about, and we can always interrogate this because it might not always be true, but one of the first things we should think about is lynching, because lynchings, of course, were extremely frequent during this period. The fear of lynching was omnipresent if you were a black person in not just the 19th century, but well into the 20th century as well. And within this, again, tradition, this black or African American poetry and literary tradition, there are a seemingly endless array of poems about lynchings, and they all, for obvious reasons, feature trees. One example is the Richard Wright poem, Between the World and Me. And I'll just read a bit of this poem. You can find it. It's in the public domain. I would encourage you to Google it. But here is a line or a section from that poem. There was a design of white bones slumbering forgottenly upon a cushion of ashes. There was a charred stump of a sapling pointing a blunt finger accusingly at the sky. So I think that because basically what we see in Wright's poem is quite similar to what we see in Grimke's, this notion of a tree pointing, it seems, a finger at the sky. And what's the implication of this? Why do that? Well, I think with Wright, it's a bit clearer. There's this sense, perhaps, this sense of accusation, perhaps at God or some deity in the sky. And again, if we just think about what the tree often represents in the poems and the literature from these periods, it's synonymous with lynching. It's synonymous with this violence done by white people against black people. And so there is this sense, perhaps, that by pointing a finger at the sky, what poets like Grimke and Wright are perhaps suggesting is, why, God, why would you allow this to happen? And I think this idea opens and has this cascading effect. It opens all of these interesting questions about to what degree we ascribe power to gods and deities. If they are in fact benevolent, why would they allow these sorts of atrocities to happen? And again, it's not like figures like Wright or Grimke necessarily propose answers to any of those questions more than anything. And this is what good poetry, like good literature, like good philosophy ultimately does. It asks interesting questions. It opens spaces for thought and conversation. But what I also think is interesting about this poem, again, is this sense of contrast, especially when you place the poem within a certain context, like the context of what trees or what the tree could theoretically represent for a black poet in the Harlem Renaissance, because the lyricism of this poetry, the sublime sense or the sublime feeling that we as readers almost get, it certainly placed in a kind of contrast to, or a kind of horrifying contrast when you think about what the tree could possibly represent. So again, I'll read, because it's such a short poem, I'll read it again. I have just seen a beautiful thing, slim and still against a gold sky, a straight cypress, sensitive, exquisite, a black finger pointing upward. Why, beautiful still finger, are you black, and why are you pointing upward? So again, I think there's something about, especially the beginning of the poem, when you focus on words like beautiful, slim, still, sensitive, exquisite, all of this, it sounds like the sort of thing you would hear in the sort of poetry that's designed to delight and entertain, but again, within a particular sort of context, it almost, through contrast, has the effect of rendering this environment not sublime and not beautiful, but potentially horrifying. So, okay, we can move on from Angelina Grimke. I think for now, what I would like to do is talk about the Langston Hughes poem Harlem, which begins on page 1073. Okay, and this is one of the more popular, iconic poems from the Harlem Renaissance. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over, like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? So later in the semester, we will read a play called A Raisin in the Sun, and the author of that play, she actually takes the title from this Langston Hughes poem because it's a play about housing inequality, redlining in Chicago, and it's also very much a play about this sense of a dream deferred, or a promise that is left unfulfilled. And I think here he's making reference to a variety and a myriad of different things. So I mentioned Reconstruction in that opening statement I made about the Harlem Renaissance, and I think that's certainly one way you can think about the deferral of a dream, or the deferral of the dream of freedom and equality for Black people in the United States, because what happened during Reconstruction, for the first time really in our country's history, Black people saw themselves to some degree reflected in the positions of power that in many ways create the potential for the sorts of things that I was just talking about: freedom, equality, etc. But of course, with the swift end of Reconstruction and the introduction of Jim Crow, all of those gains were lost to threefold. And so I think for someone like Hughes, ultimately what he's thinking about is not just the idea of a dream deferred, or the idea of a dream or a promise that was given or made but never quite fulfilled, but also what happens to dreams and promises when you start to see and realize and actualize some parts of those dreams, some parts of those promises, only to see them snatched away, and to actually see yourself regress a little bit, or to see yourself put in a position to regress. You're almost at the point perhaps of thinking, well, are we potentially in a worse spot now than we were when all of this began? And I think for someone like Hughes, it's the cyclical nature of that kind of dynamic, again, where it's not just that a dream is not fulfilled, or a promise isn't made, or the contours of a promise are not made and fulfilled, but the sense that we're actually farther behind than when we started. And what Hughes ultimately tries to dramatize here is the psychological effect of having dreams deferred. What happens when a promise is made but never fulfilled? What happens happens when a dream is deferred and never fulfilled? What kind of psychological effect does it have? Does it create a sense of anger and frustration? Does it create a sense of stagnation? Does it just disappear? Does it dissipate? Does it evaporate? How do people react to having their dreams deferred and with this ending, or does it explode? And I think it's important to notice that this is a poem that was written in 1951. And again, as much as I don't like to do this, I think it's important at times to do this. When placing this poem in a particular context, you'll notice in 1951, we're getting closer and closer to the civil rights movement and the way that those efforts toward racial equality created this explosion, it seems, or it created this explosion because how long could people take this? I think this is a poem that understands and dramatizes that dynamic in interesting ways, but even just the visual imagery here and this sense of something. And again, he's using, of course, these very real and tangible things as a way of dramatizing these psychological effects, but the images he uses, I think it's really quite fascinating. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? And I think it's interesting because a raisin, of course, is already a piece of fruit that's a bit dehydrated, that's had something taken from it. But what do you do when you put it in a position to lose what little bit it has left? Or even the idea of a sore festering. So again, it's not a clean, unharmed piece of someone's body that develops a sore, but it's something where the sore's already there. But even, again, some of this imagery like rotten meat that's just left out and there's no one there to collect it or protect it or even dispose of it. It's just left to be picked apart by carrion crows, and I think all of this, again, all of these different, while they seem disparate, which is to say not really connected, there doesn't feel like a obvious trajectory here. It feels, again, like Hughes is just experimenting with different figurative language, metaphors, etc. It all perhaps does the work of effectively dramatizing the psychological effect of racism, and again, when thinking about this dream deferred, it's the promise of a post-racist world, or a world beyond a lot of the horrors that individuals like Langston Hughes experienced in their lifetime. The references here, these similes, these metaphors, etc., while they seem disparate and disconnected, I think they all have the effect of effectively communicating exactly what someone like Hughes felt, and like what his compatriots felt, experiencing what they experienced for as long. And I think that's part of it too. It's the duration that is part of the problem as well. The duration is part of what's so demoralizing also. Okay, again, this is an interesting and important poem. I think there are better poems perhaps to talk about, but I think you can see why it's so revered and heavily anthologized. So with all of that said, I think I want to finish today with the Claude McKay poem Harlem Shadows, which begins on page 1076. Okay. I hear the halting footsteps of a lass in Negro Harlem when the night lets fall its veil. I see the shapes of girls who pass to bend and barter at desire's call. Ah, little dark girls who, in slippered feet, go prowling through the night from street to street. Through the long night until the silver break of day, the little gray feet know no rest. Through the lone night until the last snowflake has dropped from heaven upon the earth's white breast, the dusky half-clad girls of tired feet are trudging, thinly shod from street to street. Ah, stern, harsh world, that in the wretched way of poverty, dishonor, and disgrace has pushed the timid little feet of clay, the sacred brown feet of my fallen race. Ah, heart of me, the weary, weary feet in Haarlem wandering from street to street. So the first thing I would want to bring to your attention, of course, is the speaker. And unlike the County Cullen poem from before, this is not a we, this is an I poem. So in that way, perhaps there's this sense that whomever's speaking, what they want to offer the reader is something more subjective, perhaps something limited in some way. But I think especially after you read the poem, it becomes quite clear that what McKay's speaker wants to do is to bear witness to, and I think that's part of what's happening in this poem, is the sense that the speaker bears witness to this atrocity. And I would also encourage you to notice how, and we'll talk about the final stanza because there is this lament, it seems. This speaker doesn't feel perhaps nearly as detached as Cullen's speaker from before. This is a speaker who is emotionally invested, psychologically invested, etc. But I would encourage you to notice the verb that begins this poem, because it's not sight, it's sound. I hear the halting footsteps of a lass in Negro Harlem when the night lets fall its veil. This is quite interesting because I think starting with hearing something instead of seeing something does a couple of different things. And I would encourage you just pause for a minute and think about what you feel when you hear footsteps, because I think footsteps can be so suggestive of how someone feels, of what they're doing, because when we hear footsteps, depending on the pace, it could imply that someone's in danger if they have this quick staccato pace. It could imply that they are happy and content if the pace of their steps seems perhaps even lazy or lackadaisical. But these footsteps are halting. This is interesting. Again, we begin with not sight, but sound. And so in that way, sound seems to inform sight, because there's so much that this speaker doesn't actually see, and so much that this speaker doesn't allow us as readers to see. But I think we're meant to infer so much from what this speaker hears. And beginning with sound also allows McKay to highlight what I would argue is one of the most important metaphors and symbols in this poem, which is feet and footsteps. Because feet, especially in this poem, they're so important, because notice how the feet themselves, notice how the composition of these feet change and shift throughout the poem. At the beginning of the poem, they are slippered feet. And there's even this verb prowling. They go prowling through the night from street to street. I think there's a couple of interesting things happening here. First, this word prowl seems to imply perhaps power and dominance. When you prowl, perhaps you're more of a predator and less prey. But there's also this interesting contradiction, because they are predators who also have slippered feet, which would imply something perhaps delicate, something soft. So perhaps that contradiction is a bit of foreshadowing for what happens later. But it doesn't take McKay's speaker long to arrive in stanza 2 at this idea that their feet begin to represent perhaps the horrors and the degradation that they experienced on this particular night. And this is lines 11 and 12, the dusky half-clad girls of tired feet are trudging thinly shod from street to street. So notice here, and the mirroring that happens from stanzas 1 to 2, it's fascinating. Again, notice, unlike perhaps what we often think of when we think of the Harlem Renaissance, figures like Langston Hughes with his experimental style, there's a kind of formal consideration here that's actually quite fascinating, because you'll notice the word tired mirrors the word slippered from stanza 1, and the word trudging mirrors the word prowling from stanza 1. So we can see this clear, perhaps degeneration of some kind, where in the opening stanza they were prowling, their feet were slippered, but in stanza 2, they are trudging and their feet are tired. This is fascinating. Again, utterly fascinating. And then when we arrive in stanza 3, you'll notice their feet are actually weary. And I think just as a way of emphasizing this point, you'll notice that Mackay actually repeats the word weary. Ah, heart of me, the weary, weary feet in Harlem, wandering from street to street. And the way the word wandering actually doesn't match stanzas 1 and 2, I think is fascinating, because when you think about what it means to wander, again, here, Mackay, he's actually departing, it seems, stylistically from stanzas 1 and 2, as if the word wandering itself has wandered out of place. And again, this effectively and interestingly mirrors the larger point he wants to make, which is these young girls. And again, if you're perhaps not quite getting what Mackay's alluding to, they've been prostituting themselves all evening. And what that does, what that behavior does, it seems, according to Mackay's speaker, to these girls, is it leaves them in this dispossessed place. They are wandering, they are lost. And what I also think is interesting about this poem, because again, he uses that word Harlem, so Harlem shadows. This is important because often, and this is something that a figure like Langston Hughes is often accused of doing, of in his poetry at times depicting Harlem as this utopia for Black people. And while there were certainly some utopian elements to it, like any utopia, it's not actually true. It's more of a fantastical, fictional dream or idea that whomever's speaking or writing perhaps wants to exist in the world. And what Mackay is quite good at doing is actually revealing or uncovering or bearing witness to some of the more seedy elements of Harlem, because I think what's also important to acknowledge here, even though there isn't really a direct reference to it anywhere in the poem, is how for these little girls, these young girls who have prostituted themselves, it's quite possible, in fact, unmistakably probable, that their clients were not Black men, but white men. And I think what this has the effect of doing is perhaps regrettably disabusing the reader of this sense that, well, while most of the country was not hospitable to Black people, there were these enclaves, there were these pockets. It does the work of actually disabusing the reader of that and suggesting that even for someone like Claude McKay or Langston Hughes, Angelina Grimke, their utopias were still compromised in the same ways that for many Black Americans the rest of the country was, and in many respects still is or remains to this day. So a couple of other things to notice, again, about this poem. We talked about feet and how this idea or this notion, the way feet are used symbolically, and the evolution, or perhaps more accurately, the de-evolution of these feet throughout the poem functions symbolically for Mackay as a way of representing some of these larger ideas, in particular about the exploitation of Black women. But what I also like about this poem is how at the end, again, Mackay's speaker, he's not this detached, dispassionate figure. This is a person, whomever they are, they're deeply troubled by this. I'll read the final stanza again. Stern, harsh world that in the wretched way of poverty, dishonor, and disgrace has pushed the timid little feet of clay, the sacred brown feet of my fallen race. Heart of me, the weary, weary feet in Harlem wandering from street to street. I would encourage you to notice just how, unlike the previous two stanzas, there's something, again, structurally, stylistically about this stanza that communicates just how disheartened Mackay's speaker is. There's all of these interjections that you would think, well, if someone actually wrote this and edited it, they would edit those moments out. But I think they're here for a obvious and strategic reason. There's the ah that begins the final stanza, and then there's another one that begins the penultimate line. And again, we talked about the repetition of a word like weary, the way wandering in the final line doesn't match words like prowling and trudging from stanzas 1 and 2. There's something about this final stanza structurally that's meant to communicate just how disheartened and demoralized McKay's speaker is. And again, I think what's interesting about it is how there's something of a departure happening in this final stanza. There's something about the tone of the poem that obviously shifts from stanzas 1 and 2 to the final stanza. And once again, I think if you wanted to write an essay about speakers, I think this is an interesting example, especially if you contrast it to the County Cullen poem from earlier. Again, that poem, there's something more consistent about that speaker's tone, but with McKay, his speaker, it's as if they've not only witnessed something, but they've become aware of something that perhaps they were unaware of before. Perhaps this speaker, if we wanted to speculate, they were a bit naive, and here they are left to confront the rather harsh, rather brute reality of what this world is. And again, part of what's so demoralizing about it is how, for especially poets like Langston Hughes, in some of his poetry and a lot of his poetry, Harlem, he really crafts Harlem and depicts Harlem as this utopia. And you can see McKay come along and just completely disabuse him or anyone, yourself, myself, etc., of those sorts of comforting ideas. So, okay, I think because of time constraints, that's where I want to stop. I know there's a couple of poems I did not have an opportunity to talk about, but if you have thoughts about them, you can obviously write about them in this week's discussion post. Check the schedule for next week, because next week is a little different. Make sure you understand what's expected of you, and I'll be back early next week with some instructions about the poetry unit exam. You should have a sense of what's expected of you for the poetry unit essay. Don't forget, you can submit a rough draft, but please email me if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you early next week.